Welcome to episode 44 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who's not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any question about that, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's episode, we'll cover roughly lines 548 through 633 from Book 3 of the Latin text. The topic will be additional evidence from which we conclude that the mind cannot continue to exist separate from the body after death. Now let's join the discussion with Elayne reading today's text.
And center of man fixed in one certain place, as the ears, eyes, and other senses that preside over life, and as the hands and eyes and nose, when separated from the body, are incapable of sense or even to be, but must in a very short time corrupt and putrefy. For the mind cannot subsist of itself without the body, or even be in the man, which is as it were a vessel to the soul, or anything else you can conceive more closely united to it, for it sticks inseparably to the body and cannot be divided from it. So the vital powers of the body and mind exert themselves together and live united by the strongest bonds. Neither can the nature of the mind alone dispense the vital motions of itself without the body, nor can the body, void of soul, continue or use the faculties of sense. For as the eye, torn out roots, separated from the body, can see nothing, so the soul and mind cannot act of themselves, because they are spread all over the body by the veins, the bowels, the nerves, and bones. Nor could the seeds of the soul exercise those vibrations that produce sense, were they disposed at wide intervals and enclosed by no solid body. They show these sensible motions because they are shut up close, which they cannot exert even when they are forced out of the body into the wide air after death, because they are not under the same restraint as they are within the enclosure of the body. For the air would be an animal, if the soul could be confined within it, and maintain those motions of sense which before it exercised in the nerves and through the limbs. You must confess, therefore, over and over, that the mind and soul, for they both make up but one substance, must needs be dissolved as soon as they are stripped of the covering of the body, and their vital powers thrown out into the thin air. Again, since the body cannot bear the separation of the soul, but it soon putrefies and stinks, how can you doubt but that the principles of the soul diffused through the whole body and raised from the very inmost parts of it flow out like smoke, and therefore the rotten body, thus changed, falls to pieces in so ruinous a manner, because the seeds of the soul, which preserved the whole, are moved widely from their place, and flow through the limbs and all the winding passages of the body. And hence you are fully satisfied that the nature of the soul is spread over all the limbs, and is first broken and divided in the body itself, before it flies out into the air abroad. Nay, more, whilst the man is still living, the soul seems often to receive a violent shock, so that the limbs are dissolving all over, the face looking pale, as if it were real death, and all the members of the body wan and ghostly, falling to pieces. This happens in a swooning fit, when the soul is going and trembles upon the verge of life, and all the faculties strive to hold fast the chain that binds up soul and body together. The mind and all the powers of the soul are then shaken, and are so staggered with the body that a force a little stronger would drive it to utter dissolution. Do you doubt now whether the soul thrown out of the body, abroad, destitute, into the open air, stripped naked, be so far from remaining entire to eternal ages that it cannot subsist so much as for the least moment? And then no dying man ever perceived his soul go out whole from all parts of the body at once, nor felt it first creeping up his throat, then rising up to his jaws, but he finds it fail in that part of the body wherein it is placed. as he knows that every sense expires in its proper organ. But if this mind were immortal, it would not, when dying, complain of its being dissolved, but rather rejoice that it was going freely abroad, that it had thrown off his coat as a snake, or as an old stag that casts his heavy antlers. And why is not the mind, with all its reason and conduct, produced in the head, the feet, the hands, but that every part is fixed to one place and to a certain situation? If proper places were not appointed to all beings in which to be born, and when produced where they might abide, and where every member might be so conveniently disposed that there might be no preposterous order of the limbs throughout the whole, so regularly does one thing follow another, that fire is never raised from water, nor cold from heat. Besides, if the nature of the soul be immortal, and enjoys the power of sense when separated from the body, you must, as I conceive, supply her with the use of the five senses, nor can we imagine how without them the soul can live in the shades below. The painters and the poets, many ages ago, have represented the souls endued with sense, but neither eyes, nor nose, nor hands, nor tongue, nor ears can be separately in the soul, nor can they separately retain any sense, nor even be without it.
Thank you for reading that, Elayne. I have some ideas that we can probably discuss, but they are more general, and we probably ought to start first by just going through and see if anybody has any comments on the details of what we've read today.
Yeah. The first two sections here are really going along the same lines as what we talked about last time, and this idea that of the soul not being able to survive outside of the boundary of the body, really because of being too spread out, nothing to contain it, which is interesting. I got cracked up during part of it and had a hard time not laughing about the there's a couple of things I feel like Lucretius had to have meant us to laugh about the air being an animal.
There's lots of sections in Lucretius, and maybe even some Epicurus too, where they're pointing out things that are so ridiculous you almost have to think that they're laughing as they ridicule another position.
I mean, feeling your soul creeping up in your throat.
Yes, that was one of the sections I heard laughter there.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate his sense of humor.
There's no doubt he's spending a lot of time on marshaling his arguments here on this particular issue of the soul not being able to survive outside the body. I guess we're in book 3, and Charles, maybe you can correct me, but I'm thinking that as we get a little bit further, we're going to come to the basic conclusion that death is the end of the soul, and we have some pretty well-known passages and arguments at the end that are more broad about why we should not worry about that. But I think that's the direction we're going in book 3.
I kind of want to hear from Martin. So I feel like this is a really important idea here about the spatial, sort of the loss of density or of parts of a whole, like the seeds of the soul, that at a certain point, if you lose density, whatever you were talking about is no longer identifiable as being a thing anymore. Am I making sense?
Yeah, but the problem is that Lucretius doesn't make fully sense here. The thing is that from observation he gets a lot of things right, but then again, because this derived model is just somewhat analog to what we actually know now by medicine, but it's not really it. So and that's why this concept of the soul, for example, having its own particles, special particles, lighter than others, I mean, that's wrong. So
well, yeah. So I don't mean that. I think we know that's wrong. I'm talking about the idea of at a certain point in a spectrum of losing density and cohesiveness, humans no longer recognize something as a defined object.
Yeah,
and I hadn't really thought about that before, but I think he's getting at that.
I mean, that's the thing we would need to see more specific, because for some, it depends how that loss of density is happening. So depending on what it is, we may still perceive it as a whole. It just become lighter or something like that.
Right. I'm not sure I'm getting my point across.
But if we have a nervous system, no? So where we have the sense of touch, I don't know how much it is, every millimeter or something like this, And if this one is diluted by a factor of 100, that means we have actually every centimeter, because it's diluted over the square. So that means then we still have a sensor every centimeter. That means even if we lose 99% in that homogeneous way, it still works. So we can lose much, and it's still workable and recognizable.
I think that's where Elayne's going, though, right, Elayne? It's just that you're talking about dilution beyond a certain point changes its nature.
Its nature, and I would say, although he doesn't say this, it changes our agreement to recognize it as a thing. So I think he's relying on that in the readers, that at a certain point of being spread out, the reader is going to say, well, that's not any longer an item because it's too spread out. And we do that. Our minds, so like if you had a rock that's made of a certain mineral, and you pulverize it and spread it all over the whole planet, so there's only one little particle of the rock in any one place. You might say, oh, it's all the same mineral, but you're not going to say it's still a rock because it's too spread out. So that's a processing thing, the way our brains are. And I think he is relying on that common processing feature of human brains to recognize, okay, it's impossible, it's too spread out, so it can't really be a soul anymore.
That goes back to last week we were discussing about not being able to step into the same stream and those other issues about whether something, when it changes, is it the same thing as it was before or not? And there's a little conceptual question there about how you choose to evaluate it, because you can chop off little pieces incrementally, and at first you think that it's the same thing without too much change, but the more you keep going, eventually most people are going to come to the conclusion that it's just totally different at that point. But what point, what incremental point is that reached?
So when I read this, thinking about how people who are, I guess, immaterialists, or those kind of universal mind people, some of whom feel like it's not, they say their position's still compatible with science somehow. This would not bother those people today. They would say, fine, your soul is spread out over the whole universe. I don't see a problem.
Right.
I guess Epicurus wasn't faced with those people back in his day. That wasn't probably a thing, or he would have had to make it. He couldn't have made that argument. They would have said, sure.
Now that I'm not sure that I agree with, but I do. But clearly, because the issue of defining words and having these conceptual, if you've defined the soul as having the capacity to just float around without any problem, then you're right. You're never going to be burdened by any of these arguments that Epicurus is making about the physics of it.
Oh, but I mean, somebody who believed that the soul could be dispersed over the whole universe.
Right.
And that it would still be functioning as a soul.
But is that different from the sort of divine fire argument of the Stoics? I don't
know. I don't know enough about that.
So. Of the Stoics sounds pretty similar to that.
Okay. So, all right.
Not pneuma. I think that's void.
Nous or something, right?
One of the two.
I'm not disagreeing with you, Elayne. I'm really thinking that both kind of things are going on. I didn't know that they made that
argument back then. Yeah, but this is today. I know people who would read this and say, and your problem is, what's the problem? I can be spread out over the entire universe, and so can you.
That's right. And so that takes us back to that question: at what point does the nature of a thing lose its essential nature? Does it have an essential nature? Is everything just a matter of incremental elemental particles, or is there an essence anywhere that could be said to stay the same even though it's spreading out? So the presumption of what Epicurus is saying here is that there is not an essence to it that can be spread out. It's got a fixed location within the body. And you know from the fact that it has a fixed location that it's got a physical presence to it. It's not just some kind of an immaterial ghost that can spread out.
And today we might say something more like, which I don't think would be incompatible with what he's saying. It would just be a further development, maybe, not to put words in his mouth, but we could say that the consciousness depends on a certain amount of complexity of arrangement of matter. And, once you have lost that structure spatially, it's not there anymore.
Right. Elayne, since you have brought that up, let me ask this question that I had on my mind when we started. The opening of this passage talks about that the hands, the eyes, the nose, when separated from the body, are incapable of sense, and that the mind is a part of man fixed in one place, just as the eyes, ears, and other senses that preside over life. And so he's making the point that he's connecting sense to the issue of the mind and the soul. And then at the very end of the passage we're talking about today, he I think comes back to the issue of the powers of sense. And he starts talking about what the poets and the painters say. He says, besides, if the nature of the soul be immortal and enjoys the power of sense when separated from the body, you must, as I conceive, supply her with the use of the five senses, nor can we imagine how without them the soul can live in the shades below. So he is saying it's impossible to imagine the soul existing without sense.
Yeah.
Seems to be getting closer to that little viewpoint we had about the soul being the nervous system.
Yeah.
Right.
But where I'm going with that is that Elayne's raised the point that people today, or people who are immaterialists, might just simply say, well, who cares whether the soul has the ability to smell or not? That doesn't prove anything.
Right.
So how do you...
They would say, well, all of that information can be obtained without the senses, without the body, that it can go directly to the soul, mind, whatever, that it can skip by the senses. You don't really need those.
Right. Okay. And the ultimate direction I wanted to go in was, I think it would be interesting to compare the argument that he's making here to principal doctrine number 2, because principal doctrine number 2 seems to me to be a very high level conclusion. Death is nothing to us, for that which is dissolved is without sensation, and that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. That is certainly related to what we're talking about today, but it is an assertion that that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. I'm thinking that principal doctrine number 2 is a very conceptual level argument where he has defined that which is something to us, or life. He's defined that as possessing sensation. And yet, and of course I agree with that, it doesn't contain all the detail of the argument that we're making in Lucretius here. So I guess what I'm suggesting is, it's interesting to think about how you compare a high-level assertion like principal doctrine number 2 to all the detail that's contained in Lucretius. Do you have to have all the detail in order to accept principal doctrine number 2? And then, in fact, even after you have all the detail that's made in Lucretius, does that necessarily establish the truth of principal doctrine number 2? You can pile on the argument about how the soul probably cannot survive outside the body, and how the individual organs are located within a particular location, and so therefore the mind is too. And you can pile argument after argument after argument. Do you ever get to the point where principal doctrine number 2 stands on its own without needing that argument?
Okay, so I think, to me, what you're asking is, are there any baseline assumptions that you have to agree on a priori? I mean, is there anything that you've got to say, everything else I'm saying is based on this, and if you don't accept this thing, then we can't discuss further? But would you agree?
That's the direction I'm going, and not stating it very well, but because clearly I guess where one of the themes that I think I observe in a lot of this is that you have a conceptual argument that is often really grounded in the definition of words.
Yes.
But you also, at the same time, have a tremendous amount of observational detail. Yes. And we're insisting that those be consistent with each other. But they're not the same argument. They're at a different level of understanding, maybe directed at a different level of people, or a different context in which people are arguing. And I think that's something that's important to think about.
I really, really agree. I'm concerned about those things too, and that is why personally part of my philosophy is pragmatism. And I think Epicurus kind of hinted at it, like, if you're not going to agree with sugar or sweet, what's the exact quote? We don't have anything else to discuss.
Right.
Do you have that? I think that
you don't even have to support it with argument, because it's something that you just observe, and
right. You agree. agree to use these words and we're done with that. We're not going to deconstruct the language because that is not what we're talking about. We're talking.
Just to interrupt you for a second, even then apparently it was controversial because the passage you're referring to in Cicero's own Ends say that other Epicureans say that you can support the fact that pleasure is the good with logic. Epicurus has just been reported to have said that pleasure as the good needs no defense, pleasure because it is just like sugar is sweet. But then other Epicureans apparently came back later and said, well, no, you can go further than that. You can prove it logically. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, but if you prove it logically, you're still going to have some baseline agreement.
Yes.
My guess at that is that the baseline agreement is that you're going to recognize things as being true based on their reliability on a scale, but that if you're not even going to agree that reliability has anything to do with it, predictability, regularity, if you're going to say that's
repeatability.
Yeah, sure. If you're going to say that's irrelevant, then you're just not on the same page at all. And I mean, there's no way to have that conversation.
But Elayne, how many times do you have to repeat it before you're sure?
Well, that's not the issue. That's your personal kind of feeling of confidence. The issue is, does repetition and reliability have anything to do with it? Is that something that you're using, or is it irrelevant? Do you not care if there's predictability? Does that mean nothing to you as far as your assessment of what was true or not? Meaning that you're going to say your mind is not even operating remotely like science because you don't care if there's any kind of regularity. Is meaningless to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you have to have a sort of an understanding at the very beginning about the terms of your debate, the terms of your discussion.
Yeah, and that in this philosophy, Lucretius is repeatedly talking about regularity, and in the last passage, so regularly does one thing follow another, that fire is never raised from water nor cold from heat. So if a person doesn't care about regularity as an indicator of reality, you're just not even in the same perspective whatsoever. I mean, I don't think it even overlaps a perspective that thinks regularity matters. Once you agree that regularity is something you're looking at and that you're using to assess the nature of reality, then there's all sort of points you can take on the spectrum of how reliable is this, how regular is this, how much do I need. That's, I think, relatively trivial compared to, is regularity important or isn't it?
Right. Is regularity important or isn't it is kind of related, I think, just to the issue of the reliability of the senses themselves.
Yes.
Because Plato might say that no matter how many times it seems sweet to you, you don't know what sweet means until you get in contact with that ideal form that exists in heaven of sweetness. Just like he would say, you'd never know that particular animal in front of you is a horse unless you'll never know. I'm sorry, I'm saying it wrong. He says you never know whether the animal in front of you is a horse. The only thing you can know is this ideal of a horse that exists in another dimension. Or as Aristotle apparently would say, you don't know that is a horse until you've identified that it has the essence of a horse within it somehow.
Right. And so if they're leaving out regularity as a way to,
they're excluding it. They're excluding
it completely.
They're saying the senses are not reliable. The senses are in fact deceitful. The senses will mislead you, and if you follow the senses, you will definitely end up in oblivion and perdition because the senses are tricks.
Yeah.
Because the soul is imprisoned within the body. The soul is waiting to get out and escape from the senses so that it can come into contact with God and reality directly, which is something that is touched on in these passages today. Lucretius makes the point that the soul should be happy to get out of the body, if that were true.
Yeah, like why I have seen that argument made to religious people before too, and I don't really understand how they can get out of it, but they somehow, I don't know. It makes sense. It's a similar argument to what's being used today. So I think someone who denies the relevance of regularity to humans in our efforts to understand what's real and what's not real, if you deny that, you fall into the group of arguments where now today people would say, well, that's not even wrong, meaning we can't, we don't even have any basis to identify where you're right or wrong because you're invalidating the way that we know something's right or wrong, which is reliability, predictability, regularity.
I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but I'm going to sort of say it another way. To me, what he's doing in Principle Doctrine number 2, he's saying death is nothing to us. That is the conclusion that he's drawing that he wants us to then turn around and apply in the way we live our lives. But that conclusion, death is nothing to us, is totally dependent upon your acceptance of the issue that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. He's making a logical assertion that depends on your acceptance of the premise that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. And to me, the point I'm making right this second is that that's significant to me because the next doctrine, it says the limit of quantity of pleasure is the removal of all that is painful. And my assertion would be is that also is a high-level conceptual argument that is dependent upon a bunch of other specific particulars that you're accepting about the nature of pleasure, which is why you just don't look at this in isolation. You look at both the general argument and the particulars in order to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But anyway, the general point of what we're talking about right now is that Lucretius is providing a lot of specific observations that you can make about how the soul appears to be a part of the body that can therefore not survive when the body dies and dissolves. And that we're in the midst of all these particulars, but we also have to keep in mind the conclusion to which we're drawing, which is that in the end, the soul is going to die with the body, and dying means that it's going to lose the ability to have sense and sensation, and then we'll then be drawn to the conclusion that after we're dead, we have nothing to be concerned about.
Right.
Martin?
Yeah.
Still around? No, I'm still around. I'm listening.
Okay, good.
I don't really have a further addition to this, so it sounds all makes sense what you said in the last 10 minutes.
Charles?
I'm kind of with Martin here. I mean, I'm not seeing anything inconsistent.
Charles, do you have any general comment on the linkage of whether the soul has sensation or not to the conclusion that therefore death is nothing to us if it doesn't?
I've made that conclusion before, not exactly with all the nuances that Lucretius has discussed about the soul, but I've always linked that after you die with the death of the soul and that there is no afterlife as being part of that. Because the only other alternative I could see would be to be a bit semantical about what constitutes something that is without sensation. Like, would you consider somebody who's a bit boorish to be nothing to us? No.
Right. What about this sort of isolation chamber or sensory deprivation chamber situation that you might have your consciousness continue in existence but have no sensations whatsoever?
Well, that wouldn't render your sensations non-existent.
Maybe I misunderstand the sensory deprivation chamber, but Elayne probably confronted that argument.
So the sensory deprivation chamber is real interesting in that the way our nervous systems are set up, if we are deprived of sensory input, our brains will just start making stuff up. So this actually happens to people not in sensory deprivation. So like if you're losing your vision, you're having significant vision loss, people will start to see visual hallucinations. They don't have any kind of psychotic disorder, but their brain starts making things happen because things aren't getting through. So you just think you're seeing things. It happens when you're losing hearing. People will start to have auditory hallucinations. So not hearing, like in schizophrenia, voices talking to you, but just hearing music or things like that are not happening. So if you go into a sensory deprivation tank, I've never done it before, but what I've read before from other people is that you have all sorts of interesting experiences that your brain makes up because it's not getting any stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
So but if you're bodiless, then you also are missing those neurologic circuits that could provide you with all of that imagination kind of thing. So, you have, I guess it's a person who believes in that just doesn't think the brain is really necessary at all for any of those things to happen.
As you're saying that points me to the observation that in comparing Principal Doctrine 2 to what we're talking about, Principal Doctrine number 2 does not affirmatively assert that the soul is terminated at death. It just basically is referring to, don't be concerned about death because you have no sensation, and that which lacks sensation is nothing to us. What we're talking about in Lucretius maybe goes further than that. It says it's a different point. It is a different point. Yeah. Lucretius is saying that the soul ceases to exist as the soul at death, which is probably beyond what Principal Doctrine number 2 says.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very closely related, but you can't read the two independently and link them just based off that.
I guess I'd repeat that 2 seems to be much more at a more conceptual level as opposed to a natural physics observational level that Lucretius is talking about.
Yeah.
It does link it by saying that which is dissolved is without sensation. So Principal Doctrine number 2 is presuming dissolution. But as Elayne was asking Martin earlier, just because it's kind of diluted doesn't necessarily mean that it's lost its essential nature. Of course, I don't know what the Greek of dissolved would be. Maybe the Greek of dissolved is more than just diluted. Well, I think we're going to turn pretty quickly from here just to his general arguments about why we shouldn't be overly concerned about the fact that we die, and we're going to get out of the more medical observations pretty quickly here. Charles, do you know? We're more than halfway through book 3 now.
We're making good progress. You're doing longer sections?
Yeah, I'm going to start doing 100 or so a week.
This is a trivial point compared to the other, but I just want to comment because we are reading it in detail. I think it's interesting that he thought in a fainting fit, in a swooning fit, that the soul was going. That must have been what they thought then, that if you're fainting, maybe it wouldn't take very much more for you to die. A force a little stronger would drive it to utter dissolution. It must have been scary back then to see people faint. And like now these days, that's not what we're not worried about, that you're going to die if you faint.
There's a similar thing with kids when they ask about death, and then people use wrongly then tell something about like asleep. Then these kids get afraid from falling asleep.
Yeah, great point. That is a great point.
Maybe it was a bigger issue back then.
It might have been, and I think, it's an example of how knowing more of the details about what's actually happening can reduce your fears. So we frequently have kids or teenagers are bad to faint when they get vaccines because they have this vasovagal response. They have this it activates their sympathetic nervous system. They get upset and it causes blood vessel dilation and their blood pressure drops and they faint. It is not dangerous unless they hit their head, going down. But it scares people a little bit. But we know what it's about. So now the doctors can say, yeah, that happened. But, you're not fixing to die. Nothing's fundamentally wrong with you that happened. So knowing more information can a lot of times reduce unnecessary fears, which is a big theme in Epicurean philosophy.
Doesn't work with everybody, as we discussed last week.
That's true.
Well, I'm scanning ahead and I see that we do have at least one more week where we get to discuss the details of quivering toes that have been cut off from feet and things like that.
Oh my
gosh. Once we get past that, we should have the much more general arguments, including a specific reference to death, therefore, to us is nothing and concerns us not a jot, since the nature of the mind is proved to be mortal. So he specifically does link this argument to Principal Doctrine 2. And again, we're going to get into parts that I think people have cataloged that he has, I don't remember the number of arguments, separate arguments that he makes here at the end of the book where he reconciles us to death. I think reading the commentators, what we're about to get into at the end of book 3 is one of the most famous sections of the whole poem because it is a compilation of arguments that people read to when people die to try to get past the emotional trauma of dealing with it.
Right.
Okay, well, we probably should come to the end for today. Final thoughts. Martin.
I have none.
Charles.
Is another one of those episodes where it's just way out of my field.
Elayne.
I think I've said everything, but I think this is a very interesting section, despite the fact that we no longer think of something called a soul that has particles. There's still a lot of useful information in here.
All right. Well, then with that, we'll close for the day and be back soon. Thanks, everybody, for your time today.
All right.
Mhm.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.